Hey Guy, today we'll be exploring World War One, also known as the First World War, the Great War, or World War One, a global conflict that began in Europe on July 28, 1914, and ended on November 11, 1918. This war is one of the most influential events in world history. Listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy it, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. The First World War, a great deluge of humanity, and also the bittersweet triumph of a generation. This story, recounted step by step, will take you back to 1914, when Europe was quietly transforming under layers of political, economic, and social pressure. Slowly close your eyes, but keep your mind open to envision the journey ahead. The context of Europe. Before 1914, a decade before the first shots rang out in Sarajevo, Europe was already a finely interwoven network of powerful empires. In the west stood the British Empire, with its mighty Royal Navy fleet, and one of the largest colonial empires in the world. In the east lay the vast Russian Empire, teeming with people and stretching across multiple time zones. To the south and west was the Second French Empire, proud of its revolutionary heritage and advanced industry. Central Europe, the borderlands, was home to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling multi-ethnic realm perpetually struggling to reconcile the interests of Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and many other peoples. Beyond the Alps, the German Empire had surged to prominence since unification in 1871, pursuing rapid industrialization and harbouring ambitions to dominate Europe. Each great power was straining under both internal and external challenges. Arms race. Nations continuously expanded their armies and modernised artillery, battleships and navies. Germany and Britain in particular vied for naval supremacy, sparking an unending dreadnought race. Alliances and oppositions. In 1879, Germany and Austria-Hungary signed the Dual Alliance, forming the Central Powers. By 1907, Britain, France and Russia had established the Triple Entente, a friendly bloc formed as a counterweight. Nationalism. Within the multi-ethnic empires, calls for independence and self-determination grew louder among smaller nations such as Serbia, the Czechs, Poland and Romania. The Serbian heart yearned to create a greater Balkan by uniting South Slav territories, a vision that alarmed Vienna. Contrary to the splendour of royal courts, most people lived in hardship. Factory workers were exhausted by back-breaking labour, and peasants groaned under oppressive land taxes. Domestic politics simmered with unrest. Republican parties in France, reform movements in Britain, socialist agitation in Germany, and both revolutionary and militarist currents supporting the Tsar in Russia all combined to heat Europe's political atmosphere day by day. The flame ignites in the Balkans. In the so-called Balkan powder keg, Serbia took pride in the idea of uniting all South Slavic peoples, while Austria-Hungary viewed the separatist movement with deep suspicion. In 1908, Austria-Hungary unilaterally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, home to a large Serbian population, instantly inflaming tensions. The Serbs saw it as a stab in the back, while Austria-Hungary refused to yield. Behind this facade of confrontation, nationalist secret societies sprang up in Serbia, such as Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Unity, or Death, also known as the Black Hand. They plotted to use violence to teach Austria-Hungary a lesson and sow the spirit of national freedom. On the morning of June 28, 1914, on the sweltering morning of a summer day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Duchess Sophie von Chotek began their visit to Sarajevo. It was meant to be an important diplomatic event to soothe tensions in Bosnia, but in reality, it became the trigger for a global conflict. As they drove slowly through the narrow streets in an open-top carriage, the two royal guests waved to the onlookers. Nearby, Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian youth and member of the Black Hand, pressed himself against the curb, his heart racing. Earlier, a group of his comrades had thrown a bomb at the motorcade, but had failed to inflict significant harm. Acting on the advice of an Austro-Hungarian official, Franz Ferdinand stopped to inquire about the bombing victims and adjusted his route, inadvertently bringing the car closer to where Princip was standing. In that fateful moment, as if destiny had aligned everything perfectly, Princip drew a pistol and fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the abdomen. The second claimed the life of Duchess Sophie. The diplomatic earthquake. When news of the assassination spread, Austria-Hungary was rocked to its core. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled for nearly 68 years, was determined to punish Serbia. But before taking military action, they needed the support of Germany, their closest ally. On July 5, 1914, Austria-Hungary received an unconditional guarantee from Germany, known as the blank cheque. Germany pledged its backing under any circumstances, even if it led to total war. Germany believed that, with this support, Serbia would quickly surrender, and Russia, though it might protest, would not dare to confront them on a full scale. Declaration of war and the opening days. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary delivered an unreasonable ultimatum to Serbia, consisting of 10 harsh clauses demanding judicial and security control on Serbian territory. These demands violated Serbia's independence. After 1 day of consideration, Serbia accepted most of them, but rejected a few unconstitutional provisions. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The first shots rang out across the plains of Bosnia, ending over a month of fragile peace. Immediately, Russia mobilised its army to support Serbia, based on the Pan-Slavic Treaty. Germany, bound by its alliance obligations, issued its own ultimatum, demanding that Russia cease its mobilisation. Russia refused. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Over the next 2 days, Germany attacked Luxembourg, Belgium, and then France, executing the Schlieffen Plan to defeat France before turning to face Russia, whom they believed would mobilise slowly. When German troops crossed the neutral territory of Belgium-Britain, under its treaty to protect Belgium, declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. Europe's atmosphere instantly descended into chaos. Empires scrambled to conscript militias, civilians cheered with fervour, and long lines of young men boarded trains bound for the front. Banners and slogans calling for a swift victory lined the streets. But few foresaw the horrors to come. Dark trenches, relentless bombardment, disease, and endless farewells. The people's morale and fighting spirit. In every capital and village, recruitment units put up posters and distributed leaflets calling on citizens to enlist. The press praised the resilient youth soldiers, and wartime songs echoed everywhere. In Paris, bustling summer cafes turned into fundraising hubs for the army. In Berlin, train stations overflowed with relatives waving farewell to soldiers, eyes reddened. In St. Petersburg, women volunteered as nurses and joined in weapons production. Yet beneath all that cheering, many families were living a nightmare. Wives seeing off their husbands, mothers sending their sons away, and no one knew if they would ever meet again. The promising early days. In August 1914, all of Europe seemed suffused with confidence in a quick victory. Germany hoped to defeat France within 6 weeks, then shift its forces to East Prussia to confront Russia. Russia believed that, with its vast population and patriotic fervour, it would drive back Austria-Hungary and Germany. Britain trusted that its naval supremacy would blockade and strangle the enemy's supply lines. And France, though caught off guard by the invasion through Belgium, remained resolute in defending the motherland and upholding the Entente. In every soldier's heart burned the spirit of sacrifice and the hope that a swift peace would soon renew their strength. But war does not wait on wishes. Convoys of tanks, horse-drawn wagons and troop trains rolled endlessly forward. Machine guns, heavy artillery, barbed wire, landmines, poison gas, all became horrifying realities beyond anything they had imagined. The trench battlefield was not a dry tunnel, as described in books. but a damp maze where every inch of earth was soaked with rainwater and blood. At times, trench soldiers had to use shovels to dig additional pits, reshape the parapet, fill in broken sections of barbed wire, and then lay down wooden planks to prevent sinking. Those planks were often caked in mud. After carrying them, they needed a quick wipe to avoid slipping, even though their own feet remained soaked. This scene repeated day after day, like an endless refrain. In the secret dugouts below, the dispatch runners, young men not yet 20, held an important duty, carrying letters, situation reports and rations. They crawled through low tunnels, sometimes stooped the entire way, as small stones tumbled and clattered on their steel helmets. The sound of rain pounding the earth above the trench mingled with the whistle of the wind, sending a chill through the marrow. In the midst of night, a soldier might drift off for a few hours on a threadbare blanket, his head resting against a damp, mouldy sandbag. The cycle, sleep, wake, fight, repeated endlessly, accompanied by fleeting dreams of home and loved ones. Once, in the midst of silence, a distant artillery piece suddenly roared to life, the ground trembling like an earthquake. In an instant, men screamed for the wounded. Some dashed for a broken-hafted sabre, turned makeshift club. Others sprang up to shield their comrades. The smell of gunpowder mingled with damp mildew and the chemical stench of poison gas, weighing down the air. The two front lines lay only a few hundred metres apart, but to the soldiers, they formed an abyss separating two worlds. On one side lay guns, barbed wire, and orders. On the other, life itself and the footprints of family back home. Each morning a sentry would launch a green paper star signal, warning of enemy approach. The tiny flare arced across the grey sky, then vanished into the hazy smoke. Almost immediately, the machine gun's staccato whistle cut through the air, its bursts aimed at any silhouette that dared to emerge. At midday, when the sun rode high, the soldiers took a brief break. They opened their tin ration boxes, meals of hard bread and canned meat, occasionally accompanied by a boiled potato. Sometimes the trench squad above would salvage a few potatoes from abandoned fields and share them out. Amid the distant whine of shells, they ate in silence, exchanging a few clipped words. "Did you hear the big guns from Albert today?" "Yeah, crystal clear. They're getting ready to clear the position." Some glanced with reddened eyes, pressing their lips together to swallow each bite. On the opposite front, French drifted together with English, German and Russian. The slogan, "Every soldier is a father, a son, a brother," existed only in the newspapers. Out here, no one distinguished nationality, hearing only hostile words in the crack of gunfire. Occasionally, French and German troops would pull back a little, each side silently tending their rifles, gathering Dravesner firewood, only to, when night and freezing cold set in, lean on one another's shoulders and resume their watch. Hardships came not only from shells, disease, malaria, typhoid, wound infections, pneumonia, drained life faster than enemy bullets. The first aid trenches for evacuating the wounded were overflowing. Nurses were busy pouring saline, dressing wounds, even scooping out pus with their hands, all the while whispering to one another, "We are the last line of defence." By flickering candlelight, a soldier would sometimes murmur a prayer for his beloved home, begging some spirit to protect his comrades. Deep beneath layers of earth and rock, the artillery engineers were also calculating coordinates. They measured and adjusted barrel angles, computed the trajectory needed to destroy enemy fortifications. When night grew sufficiently dark, the oil-soaked guns roared, their smoke columns rising like erupting volcanoes. The air trembled, nearby pigs and chickens shrieked in alarm, and soldiers toppled back into the trenches, their ears ringing as if ready to burst. But within each burst of shellfire, there were still hearts that did not forget humanity. A French soldier placed a steaming cup of coffee beside a fallen German comrade, leaving a small note, "We are only victims of distant decisions." And in another engagement, when the thunder of the guns paused in the afternoon, British and German soldiers unexpectedly emerged from their dugouts together, exchanging pistols and packs of cigarettes. It was a fleeting moment in which two enemies looked at one another, then nodded in greeting before slipping back into the shadows. By day, the big guns shook the earth. By night, machine gun fire tore through the sky. Sleeping was also fighting. Resting was also preparing. Rations barely enough to sustain hope. In the dim light, tear-soaked letters from home were read over and over. The writers could not know whether they would live long enough to send their words, but the promise "I will return" still echoed on. And then, in the damp darkness, a small bell rang from the dugout. The signal for the relief shift. A fresh line of soldiers crawled up from the trench, replacing their exhausted comrades. They trudged through the mud, knowing that each short step was an act of survival. Each carried a story: a father who'd lost an arm, a sister-in-law who'd just given birth, a close friend felled by enemy fire. And now all were memories patched together amid shell fire. As night grew still, save for the wind whistling through the barbed wire, they lit a few coals and gathered for warmth. One began to croak out a traditional song. The others fell silent to listen. They did not know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment their hearts still beat in the shared comfort of comradeship. Above them the sky remained overcast with dark clouds, as if Europe itself wept without end. And one day when the red dawn returned, the march would resume with new attacks, retreats, and the hope of a final victory. But for now, let your soul align with the rhythm of time, and listen to the echoes of the millions of hearts that once fell and stood strong along the Flanders trenches. When December 1914 drew to a close, the Flanders battlefield was colder than ever. The muddy ground that was soft by day froze solid, turning into an ice jacket. Whenever temperatures dropped below zero, soldiers' breath formed white clouds drifting in the air, while their rifles and equipment rusted and wept tiny icicles. Yet despite the bitter cold, the bombardment never ceased. The war had escalated into a wound spanning tens of thousands of miles. Blizzards and frozen trenches. Each howling snowstorm felt like an assault by nature itself, burying barbed wire and makeshift fortifications under thick layers of snow. Trench soldiers huddled deeper into their dugouts, wrapping coarse cloth around their necks and hands to stave off frostbite. The precious few woolen blankets were guarded jealously and brought out only on the coldest winter nights. Inside the dugout, the temperature was only marginally higher than outside. Shivering hands clasped tight around cups of hot tea that a nurse had carried down. The men muttered prayers, hoping the warm brew would bring comfort to body and soul. Some carried a few slices of dry bread, trading them for a bit of hardened pork fat. A rare good luck charm amid the carnage. The Christmas truce. Amid that atmosphere of grief, a church bell rang from the Belgian side behind the German trenches. With surprise and suspicion, German soldiers shone their torches across no man's land. A Christmas hymn began to drift across. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night, holy night. The French, the British, and even the Russians quietly responded with Silent Night, and Oh Holy Night. In that strange moment, both sides laid down their arms, lit candles, and hung wreaths of holly on the barbed wire. They stepped into the space between the trenches, exchanged cigarettes and tins of biscuits, and even shared sips of hot wine. Wishes of Joyeux Noël and Merry Christmas rang out in the cold wind, like a small miracle amid the ruins of war. It was a single night in the entire conflict when enemies became fellow humans, united by a shared belief in peace. British soldier John McCrae, Mimikitim, with a cigarette stub between his lips, watched a French comrade pin a bouquet of red poppies to a fellow soldier's helmet, his eyes brimming with tears. A moment of profound humanity in an ocean of blood. Back to brutal reality. Christmas night eventually passed, and the artillery thundered once more as darkness blurred beneath the dawn light. Both sides quickly fell back into their trenches, rebuilding barbed wire entanglements and stacking fresh sandbags. The crack of blocking fire echoed across the supply trail, forcing newly arrived troops to bend low, caked in mud. The moments of waiting were the longest. Every footstep echoing into the dugout carried news of either a supply delivery or an impending attack. The battlefield post brought letters from home, many surviving only as fingerprints smudged by tears. One letter recounted the first snowy season under a roof without a father. Another pleaded for the soldier's swift return so that his mother would no longer be alone. Each line was laden with longing and fragile hope. Everyday life in the trenches. In the morning, when the reveille sounded, the dispatch runners opened the dugout and brought up boiling water and a few cornbread rations. The winter meal was a bland turnip soup, sometimes accompanied by a few crispy shards of pork fat. After eating, the orderlies carefully cleared snow from the trench edges and laid down wooden planks to keep the floor dry. Combat was not only about firing guns, it was also a battle against cold and mud. Early in the afternoon, the stretcher-bearer teams arrived at the first aid posts. Under hastily erected canvas shelters, nurses and field doctors splinted wounds, stitched lacerations, and cleansed burns caused by gas. They worked without pause, their hands slick with sweat, daring not to rest, for every minute of delay could cost a life. The photos and the diary. In a soldier's tunic pocket there were always a few small photographs of family, his wife, his young child, or his elderly mother smiling kindly. At night the men would turn over the photos, gently caressing their mother's face through the glossy paper, then write a few lines in their diary. Today you are safe, but if anything goes wrong, know that I have fought with faith in our reunion. The pages of the diary were stained with splashes of lime and plaster, but contained a whole world of hope and pain, gazing toward a bleak future. When the new year of 1915 arrived, nothing had changed. The trenches still stretched on, the artillery still thundered, and the fallen piled ever higher. The European powers realised that this great war could not be ended swiftly. Instead, it was a war of attrition, draining both spirit and resources. Yet in each heart, the flame of hope had not been extinguished. Hope in a poppy blooming when the war finally ended. Dreams of the day when kings would sign treaties, and wishes that millions of soldiers would return home to embrace their loved ones. Aware that the road ahead was fraught with perils, they nonetheless marched on, each slow step on the frozen ground writing the next chapter of world history. As 1915 dawned, the tension along the front lines shifted from the damp fields of Flanders to the Gallipoli campaign and the Austro-Italian border in the Alpine foothills. While the Western Front remained mired in mud and trenches, the Eastern theatres saw decisive, brutal battles unfold on the Mediterranean shores and in the Alps. Footsteps at Gallipoli. In February 1915, British and French forces launched an amphibious operation on the Gallipoli Peninsula, today's Turkey, aiming to seize the Dardanelles Strait, open a naval route to Constantinople, and strike at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, an essential ally of the Central Powers. By late March, Royal Navy and French warships began a fierce bombardment of the coastline, but the Ottomans' coastal batteries, cleverly emplaced in cliffside fortifications, fought back fiercely. Waves turned red with splintered timbers as ships collided and broke apart. British and French Marines disembarked from rubber boats onto cold, sandy beaches, hurriedly establishing defensive positions. On the first night they clashed with veteran Ottoman troops seasoned in the Balkan Wars. Cries rang out, machine gun fire swept the dunes, and smoke grenades drifted through the air. Despite their greatcoats, the Allied soldiers cowered under the chill sea wind. Sand and shell fragments churned into blinding dust, reducing visibility to mere paces. Yet at dawn, a Union Jack stood planted on a rocky outcrop, a crude declaration: "We have come for a grand purpose." Gradually they realised Gallipoli's sands were not an open plain but a labyrinth of narrow ravines where the enemy could vanish and reappear behind every boulder. Intentions and reality. Admiral John Fisher of Britain believed that naval superiority would decide the outcome. He calculated every fathom of water depth and each shell's trajectory. Yet Ottoman Defence Commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, countered with guerrilla tactics, machine gun nests at high ground, and interconnected tunnel networks for rapid counterattacks. By April, both sides were exhausted. The Allies could not expand their beachhead, and the Ottomans lacked the strength to push them back. Hundreds of thousands of casualties littered Gallipoli's sands, soldiers' bodies strewn beneath blistering sun and salt-laden winds. Switching to the Alpine front, not only at Gallipoli but in the Alps, Austria, Hungary, and Italy fought for every mountain pass. Vienna had assumed Italy's forces would be easily subdued, but when Italy joined the Entente in May 1915, waves of Italian soldiers, supported by long-range artillery, advanced up the steep slopes. Austro-Hungarian General Konrad von Hötzendorf established tight defences at Passo di Vezzena and Col di Lana. In the white snow, sappers scaled cliffs by lantern light, drilling holes to plant mines beneath enemy positions. Under cover of darkness, detonations shattered the ice, halting Italian supply. Columns, horse-drawn wagons and troops lay buried in frozen carnage. Life amidst the ice. Above 2,000 metres, thin air and brutal cold prevailed. Daytime temperatures hovered around 10 degrees, plunging to 30 degrees at night. Italian soldiers shivered in yellow-stained greatcoats, while Austro-Hungarian troops huddled inside canvas sleeping bags. Every hour they rubbed their hands and feet raw, or boiled corn soup, spiked with a dash of wine to stave off frostbite. Letters, penned on fragile paper that tore easily, read, "I am holding up under the snows. Please keep mother warm for me." Some men carved their loved one's name into their rifle stocks with a dagger, a promise etched in steel to return home. Why Gallipoli and the Alps failed. After 6 months, the Gallipoli campaign was suspended. By December 1915, the British and French withdrew in silence, their pride shattered. On the Alpine front, neither side secured a decisive victory, and both became locked in a stalemate of ice and scree. The causes were clear. Misjudged terrain. Gallipoli was not a flat shore, but a network of hills and ravines. The Alps were far from a gentle plateau, but the harshest battleground in Europe. Inadequate equipment. Most troops were outfitted for flat battlefields, lacking snow-proof boots or insulated tents. Broken supply lines. Warships bombarded, then retreated without securing supply vessels. Alpine roads collapsed under avalanches, and artillery ammunition ran low. Lessons for the future. The failures at Gallipoli and in the Alps served as a stark warning to both the Entente and Central Powers. Modern war was no longer a simple clash of armies on open fields, but a contest of intelligence, equipment, logistics, and terrain adaptation. Yet the tragedy was not just in the campaigns. Every soldier carried a private story. Young British Private Griffin, before embarkation, had asked his wife to knit him a scarf. When he finally received it, he pressed it to his face and tucked it into his cap, vowing, "It will keep my heart warm." Austrian infantrywoman Anna, hiding in a mountain gorge, penned letters home to Vienna, dreaming of reuniting one day in their favourite cafe by the Danube. As Gallipoli froze over and the Alps lay under endless snow, Europe began to understand that the Great War was far from over. It was spreading into every arena, the battlefield and the home front, the engines of destruction and the human heart. As the sky over Eastern Europe shifted into March 1916, the Eastern Front, the vast expanse of Russia stretching like an endless horizon, had become the boundary between two worlds. On one side, the immense, populous but industrially backward Russian Empire. On the other, the Central Powers, with their mechanised strength and organisation, mass mobilisation and the frozen march. At the end of 1915, Tsar Nicholas II ordered total mobilisation. Over 12 million rural and urban youths were summoned to the assembly centres at Pskov, Smolensk and Warsaw. Night after night, trains packed with Russian recruits rolled along, the Siberian winds whipping through open windows and leaving them shivering in their thin uniforms. The scent of locomotive oil, mixed with smoke, pulsing with the rhythm of wheels on icy rails. On the front, they faced not only enemy bullets but also nature itself. Frozen horse carcasses lining the roads, rivers solidified into ice, and supplies that could barely be delivered. Many soldiers had to carry snow knives to clear paths, dragging sledges overloaded with provisions behind them. The harsh trenches. Unlike Flanders, the trenches in East Prussia and Galicia were cut into earth and rock, waist-high on adults, their walls as dark as they were steep. In spring, melting snow turned the mud into viscous sludge, and men trudged through as if wading knee-deep in quicksand. Rats, hiding in the tunnels, scurried everywhere, gnawing at corpses and abandoned weapons. The rat-a-tat of German MG-08 machine guns and Austro-Hungarian heavy artillery echoed sharply, battering Russian positions. When German howitzers opened fire, the barley fields behind the lines rose in clouds of ash, transforming farmland into an ash-grey desert. Life of the Russian soldier. In their trenches, Russian soldiers formed small groups by village, cooking barley porridge in cast-iron pots and adding a splash of beetroot wine to ward off the cold. They knitted woolen gloves and tucked a few dried apricot blossoms into their coats, a token from home to soothe homesickness. When a tobacco parcel arrived from the rear, cigarettes circulated like treasure. The smoky tendrils curling in the dawn mist brought a fleeting peace. Russian troops seldom knew the exact date. They only marked winter, spring, and the drizzling rains that turned everything into mire. They counted days by the crackle of porridge, by the photos etched on their ammunition tins, and by the promise to return when the crops ripened. Turning point on the home front. While the front burned, Russia's rear froze under a food crisis. Bread prices soared, and railways collapsed. In Petrograd, growing numbers of women and urban workers took to the streets demanding food relief. Crowds shouted, "No bread, no war," and "End irresponsible rule." Empress Alexandra, clinging to absolutism, and her reliance on Grigory Rasputin's bad counsel further eroded the regime's prestige. Rumours and anonymous letters accusing corruption and aristocratic privilege spread through underground press channels. Ammunition factories suffered labour shortages, and sudden troop movements clogged the weapons trains in paralysis. The call of revolution. Amid the smoke of the front came the whispers of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Overthrow the Tsarist regime, redistribute the land to the peasants. Illicit leaflets dropped into trenches bore the cold-eyed visage of Lenin holding a red flag, an implicit call to soldiers. Don't fight for the Tsar, fight for the future. By summer 1916, after the Green Course, once the Tsar's Guard, was defeated by the Germans at Brusilov, Russian soldiers' faith wavered. Many refused further assaults, sitting silent in their pillboxes as artillery boomed like the drumbeat of death, hope and fear. Yet even in dire straits, glimmers of humanity remained. The Russian Red Cross continued sending volunteer nurses to the front, offering companionship, massaging wounded limbs, and delivering letters from home. Some conscientious officers secretly transported relief supplies along the rail lines, risking court-martial to ease their men's hunger. Once, amid the cacophony of guns, a group of Russian soldiers discovered a patch of wild hops by the trench. They gathered it, brewed bitter tea, and raised their mugs in a toast. Two-piece. Their quiet laughter echoed across the battlefield, a small miracle of resilience. As the summer of 1916 faded beneath pale golden light, the two great armies on the Eastern Front prepared for the offensive, named after General Alexei Brusilov, one of the largest counterattacks by the Russian Empire. At the same time, the winds of revolution began to whistle through the cities, silently fanning the flames of change on the home front. Brusilov's opening, on June the 4th, 1910, under a clear sky, over 1,000 Russian guns roared the signal simultaneously. Hundredweight shells thundered down on Austro-Hungarian positions along the Stokhod and Siversky Donets rivers. In contrast to the brief winter bombardments, Brusilov detonated mines at multiple distant points, then shattered the barbed wire defences so that his infantry could surge forward en masse. Taking advantage of the enemy's disarray, Russian soldiers armed with long bayonets, grenades and pistols crossed the newly opened earthworks and into the enemy lines. Shouts echoed through the summer air as earth and rock splintered in all directions. Many Austro-Hungarian strongpoints were encircled, royal officers lost heart, and numerous counter-attacking units were thrown into disarray. Within 3 days, a defensive front stretching tens of kilometres had been carved to a depth of 25 km, and over 400,000 Austro-Hungarian troops were killed or taken prisoner. Brusilov had proven that a multi-point attack, combined with flexible artillery-infantry coordination, could shatter even the most fortified defences. Consequences on the Russian homefront news of the victory in Galicia shook the entire Russian Empire. The once flagging Russian army, starved for ammunition and provisions, now joyfully cried out, "Russia has triumphed." In Moscow, people poured into the streets to celebrate, lighting candles in churches and gathering in cafes through the night to await more news from the front. Yet behind the cheers lay harsh reality. To concentrate artillery, for Brusilov, the government had diverted massive ammunition stocks from the Western Front to the east. This left British and French forces at Gallipoli and in Western Europe short of shells and struggling to hold their lines. At home in Russia, food prices continued to rise, and ammunition trains were frequently halted by hungry civilian protests. Political crisis and the February Revolution. Military gains came at the cost of civilian suffering. In February 1917, in Petrograd, as slush and mud covered Nevsky Prospect, tens of thousands of textile industry women and their families stood in long lines outside bakeries, staging a hunger strike against bread prices that had tripled. They shouted, "No bread, no war," and redistribute the land. On February the Old Style calendar, March 8th New Style. The movement spread rapidly. Palace guards refused to fire. Workers struck, and the railways ground to a halt. The Duma, bicameral parliament, convened an emergency session. Tsar Nicholas II hesitated, then ordered troops to crush the uprising, but to no avail. Just 2 days later, the court was in disarray. Alexander Kerensky and other progressive leaders seized control of a provisional government. Nicholas II, finding every door closed, left Petrograd and abdicated the throne on March 2nd, 1917. Thus ended the Romanov dynasty after more than 3 centuries. That night, tens of thousands gathered before the Winter Palace. Fireworks lit the sky, as if to banish every shadow of the past. Hope for peace. The provisional government under Kerensky declared it would continue the war to defend Russia's freedom and honour. But the people's will had changed. They no longer wished to sacrifice for vague ideals. Progressive newspapers called for an armistice, and many frontline units refused orders, returning home to their families. In the West, British and French presses watched events in Russia closely. They hoped the new government would sign a peace treaty, freeing Entente forces from the Eastern Front so they could concentrate their final strength against Germany and Austria. A turning point in the global war. The fall of the Tsar sent a powerful message through the Great War. Battles were no longer solely clashes of arms, but struggles for political power. Revolutionary ideologies, from liberal democracy to communism, crept into the trenches, igniting hope in those who longed for a new world. In the final letters sent home, a Russian soldier, now a free citizen, wrote, "We have overthrown the throne, but we do not yet know what new empire to build. Pray for us that peace may not be just a cry, but become reality." The Verdun front, France's stalwart fortress, Verdun, an ancient defensive stronghold on the Meuse River, was famed for its thick forts and solid ramparts. The French considered it hallowed ground. As long as Verdun held, their national spirit would endure. Conversely, Germany believed that capturing Verdun would shatter French morale and force them to surrender. From January 1916, the Germans quietly amassed heavy artillery, The 420mm Big Bertha Krupp guns, alongside dozens of 150mm and 210mm howitzers, hidden behind the Champagne and Lorraine hills. They used secret tunnels and special trains to move ammunition to the forest's edge, preparing for the great bombardment to rain down on Verdun. February 24 for me 16. The battery ignites. Before dawn's first light, the eastern skies over Verdun rumbled under more than 1.2 million artillery shells. The continuous blast sounded like peals of thunder, and plumes of black smoke rose, turning morning into a simulated dusk. Earth and rock exploded in shrapnel, barbed wire entanglements were shredded, and deep trenches became pools of red mud. In the trenches, stunned French soldiers heard the alarm bells. Through smoke and dust-laden wind, they risked crawling out to make repairs, salvaging shell fragments to patch trench walls. The smell of burning wood, gunpowder, and the chemical stench of explosions blended into an oppressive air, making every breath feel heavy. Life in the hellish vortex. Even compared to Flanders, Verdun was more brutal. The distance between opposing trenches was sometimes only a few dozen metres, but every step risked triggering a mine, a buried demolition charge, or a concealed machine gun nest. The French established the Voie Sacrée, Sacred Way, the only road linking Verdun to the rear, through which convoys of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and even hand-pulled carts ran day and night to deliver food, ammunition, and medical supplies. At night, oil lanterns along the road guided incoming relief. Soldiers whispered demi-tour, shift change, reminders to stay silent and avoid enemy artillery fire. Occasionally, a faint rendition of La Marseillaise would drift through the barrage, a tiny spark of resolve amid the cannon fire. Overwhelming figures. In 6 months of bloodshed, German and French forces alternated between attack and defence, each suffering horrendous losses. It is estimated that up to 300,000 casualties occurred on each side. Over 500,000 soldiers fell. Verdun's forts and surrounding pine forests were levelled, replaced by a barren field littered with shell craters. Yet remarkably, French morale held firm. The soldiers called themselves les poilus, the hairy ones, and stood unyielding through each earth-shaking bombardment. Even when they lost comrades and weapons, they remained like living walls, ready to strike back at the first opportunity. The Somme offensive, continued carnage. Before Verdun's survivors could recover, in July 1916, British and French forces launched the Somme offensive to relieve pressure on Verdun and force Germany to spread its troops thinner. The plan called for a massive artillery barrage to break the defensive trenches, followed by infantry assaults to seize high ground and enemy rail lines. On July 3rd, over 1.5 million shells fell relentlessly on the Somme for 7 days and nights in what became known as the Week of Artillery. When the bombardment ceased, 100,000 British infantry advanced, only to confront intact German underground defences. The German MG-08 machine guns cut them down, claiming 20,000 lives on that opening morning alone. In 4 months of fighting, more than 1.2 million casualties were recorded on both sides. The golden wheat fields of the Somme lay stained with red mud and twisted iron fragments, flickers of hope. Amid the staggering losses, acts of humanity still emerged. Occasionally, in the silent nights, British and German soldiers would light candles together in the no-man's land between the trenches, reminding each other of life's value. Some British officers invited German soldiers over to share hard-tack biscuits. Through these small gestures, the belief that this war will end continued to take root. Dawn in the trench, the repeating rhythm of life. Every new day in the trench begins when a piercing whistle sounds through the thin morning mist. The flickering lantern light reveals the muddy path, where fresh recruits and veterans line up to receive their dry rations. Hard bread, a bit of canned meat, and porridge powder. A cup of boiling water is passed hand to hand. Lips tremble as they press together, trying to hold on to warmth. After the hurried meal, the mine clearance team, les sapeurs, emerges forward, carrying picks, shovels, and fresh coils of barbed wire. They are responsible for detecting and removing mines, digging saps, and placing or neutralizing explosives. This work is not for the faint-hearted. Every skipped heartbeat, every tense eye scanning the soil must guard against accidentally triggering an unknown mine. The silent role of les sapeurs. A sapper, literally a combat engineer, often wears patched clothing and an unadorned helmet so as not to attract enemy fire. They build and maintain the tunnel systems through which dispatch runners, sick soldiers, and hand-pulled carts carry supplies. By night, a sapper enters the cramped earth with an oil lantern and a rough schematic. Using an iron probe, they carefully drill a small hole and insert a safe fuse to destroy an enemy emplacement or open a supply route. Their work demands intelligence, absolute caution, and boundless courage. Each success gives hundreds of comrades another chance at life. Life in no man's land. Between the opposing trenches, known as no man's land, lies a dead zone riddled with shell craters and snarled barbed wire. By day, no one dares move. By night, flares and the hiss of mortar fire cut through the darkness. Still, some daring medical teams establish mobile aid stations in the neutral zone. They carry bandages, ether, and makeshift suturing kits, clenching vials of the first antibiotics between their teeth. At the cry of wounded men stranded amid the shelling, they crawl over sappers' marked paths, swiftly dress wounds, and carry the injured back to the warm dugouts. Medical advances, miracles, amid hell war accelerated medical breakthroughs, antiseptics and anaesthetics. While penicillin was not yet widespread, the first sulfonamide treatments were being tested. Many wounded soldiers survived thanks to antiseptic-soaked dressings that halted infection. Ether and chloroform were used extensively under dim lantern light, easing surgical pain. Mobile X-ray units, early X-ray butterflies, were mounted on horse-drawn wagons and manoeuvred through narrow trench routes, allowing doctors to locate metal fragments in bodies more quickly and accurately. Field surgery teams, volunteer nurses, mostly women, received basic surgical training. They served as second doctors, helping to extract shrapnel, stitch wounds, and triage casualties before transfer to main operating facilities. Thanks to Fünfhundertmeterhaus, these advances, countless soldiers who seemed doomed managed to return home and retell their stories of trench darkness, and of the brave nurses who brought smiles to their faces as the lanterns went out. Letters and small gifts. On rare quiet nights, soldiers exchange letters from home. Each letter is folded small, slipped into a uniform pocket, then read aloud so the whole group can hear. The scent of fragrant paper and the trembling handwriting bring a hush of calm. Small gifts, a piece of chocolate, a packet of cigarettes, a handkerchief embroidered with Mon Amour, become treasures. Soldiers share them, sip hot tea, and vow that if they survive, they will deliver these tokens themselves to their loved ones. Music and moments of silence. Sometimes at night, a warm horn call drifts from the command post. A military musician plays Danny Boy, a gentle, sorrow-tinged melody. In place of distant gunfire, that music brings a brief peace, allowing soldiers to find solace before returning to the brutal routine. Hope. The red poppy. Through the mud and long nights of shelling, French and British troops kept the tradition of carrying a red poppy, a symbol of life blooming amid devastation. Even a single wilted petal reminds them of fresh spring fields, and of the peace that will follow when the guns finally fall silent. Late autumn 1916 spread over the Somme fields. The last volunteer units, British, French, and soldiers from the colonies alike, began to march away from the front line. The 4-month artillery storm had exhausted their strength, but more than anything, It had tested their perseverance and comradeship. Orderly withdrawal. Oil lantern signals were lit in the command dugout, marking the moment of evacuation, withdrawal. Line after line of soldiers, knees bent and rust-stained packs on their shoulders, silently crawled up from the trench, the smell of mud mixed with the scent of worn canvas gear, stinging their eyes. They knew that after the withdrawal would come days of recovery and retraining before returning to the front next spring. Before moving out, the sapper teams cleared no man's land of any remaining charges. Mine guards chalked out a safe corridor so the troops would not accidentally trigger an explosive. Behind them, the medical detachment set up makeshift first aid stations, ready to collect seriously wounded men who could not yet be moved. A brief ceasefire. On a stretch of open ground between two shattered barbed wire entanglements, the world fell eerily silent. A few whispered words drifted from the opposite trench. Truce? A short ceasefire was agreed, lasting from midnight until dawn, to recover the dead and the wounded. In the neutral zone, a handful of French and German soldiers cautiously stepped forward, exchanging an awkward handshake amidst the lingering smell of gunpowder. They bent to carry out their fallen comrades' bodies, carefully retrieving helmets and dog tags to send home later. A soft chorus of La Marseillaise blended with Deutschland über alles, a brief prayer for peace. The wounded and the final letters. Along the retreat route, stretcher-bearer teams erected temporary rest stops for the lightly wounded. They linked arms to support the injured, used simple wooden stretchers to transfer them through artillery tunnels, and then loaded them onto trains bound for rear area hospitals. The odour of antiseptic mixed with the stench of dried blood, making everyone shudder. In many tunic pockets lay the last letters from home, reminders to take care of themselves, news of newborn children, hopes for reunion. Those letters were gathered and sent along with the bodies of comrades later, serving as a final milestone of life on the battlefield. Losses and significance. The price of 4 months of bloodshed on the Somme was over 1.2 million casualties, including more than 300,000 British losses. Many artillery batteries, early Mark I tanks, and reconnaissance aircraft were tested in combat. Although the initial objectives were not achieved, the Somme campaign forced Germany to spread its forces thinner, relieving pressure on Verdun, where fighting still raged. Looking back, commanders on both sides drew harsh lessons. Massed assaults could not replace deeper penetration tactics or tighter coordination among infantry, artillery, and air support. Yet it was precisely these priceless sacrifices that propelled advances in battlefield medicine, logistics, and cemented the concept of trench warfare as the symbol of World War I, preparing for the final 1916 offensive. As the troops withdrew to the rear, fresh units were brought up to take their place. The first winter night on the Somme was more gloomy than any before. Ice and fog obscured all sightlines. But even in the cold, preparations were underway. German artillery realigned its batteries, 150 mm and 105 howitzers trained on the Somme fields, hoping to blunt the spring offensive. On the Entente side, training officers taught the new arrivals how to survive in frozen trenches, how to move quickly across no man's land, and how to recognise light signals for safe changeovers. Sopwith camel fighters and light armoured cars were earmarked for deployment in the northeast to protect the supply convoys. Final reflections. Before winter, in the command dugout, Lieutenant Colonel James Caldwell spoke softly over the field radio. Men, keep your spirits up. Through snow or shell fire. Dure. His voice was hoarse but managed to kindle belief. The troops below listened, determination shining in their eyes by the oil lamp glow. At a makeshift redoubt on the forest's edge, French soldiers gifted each other hand-knit checkered scarves, carving their names and the date of withdrawal into the threads. They stowed away the carved wooden chopsticks, gifts from nearby villagers, as a promise that when we return, we will share a meal together. The Italian-Austrian front in 1917 was tense every moment. Our journey will begin at the gentle banks of the Piave River, where the heroic Italian retreat was made, and extend into the harsh mountain passes of Trentino. Background of the Italian-Austrian front. After the heavy defeat at Caporetto in October 1917, the Italian army conducted an organised withdrawal to the Piave River, a winding river across the Veneto foothills, to re-establish defensive lines and block the Austro-German advance. The river's clear green waters flowed serenely beneath ancient pine forests, seeming to promise endless peace, yet in reality forming a deep natural trench where Italian soldiers' resolve faced its ultimate test. The Austro-German forces, under Crown Prince Karl and General Otto von Below, buoyed by their victory at Caporetto, immediately split into two assault columns, one following the riverside highway, the other moving along the mountain slopes to encircle Italy's rear. Austro-Hungarian heavy artillery and German mortar batteries relentlessly shelled the thinly held defensive positions, the rain of shells blending with late autumn leaves to create a choking haze, defending the Piave's banks. On November 16, 1917, the Italians, reinforced by French and British units withdrawn from Gallipoli, organised strongpoints along the right bank of the Piave. They dug deep trenches, built earthworks and used stone revetments and sandbags to protect against the river's floods. Each position lay a few hundred metres apart, connected by temporary tunnels, and in places reinforced with concrete bunkers called Aussichtstellung, reserve positions. Across the river, Austro-German sappers cleverly planted mines on the riverbed at low tide, hoping to expose the stones so infantry could storm across. But the Italians were vigilant. They kept scouts in small boats out at night to detect and disarm fuses. As winter approached and water temperatures dropped to 230 degrees, the freezing currents made clearance work even more perilous. Battle at the narrow stretch. One foggy dawn, Italian artillery opened a preparatory barrage on the Austro-German heights across the river. The thundering guns shook the cliffs, and white smoke plumes rose over the floodplain. As the barrage died away, hundreds of Italian soldiers pushed floating wooden planks and makeshift rafts into the Piave. In groups, they filled shell craters, set booby traps for counterattacks, and then surged ashore to face the enemy. The crack of rifle fire and cries of "Avanti!" rang across the front. Austro-German machine guns swept the crossings, but their maximum range could not cover the river's narrow width. Some Italian groups exploited the enemy's lapse, slipping through dense reed beds on the bank and launching surprise flank assaults. The 10th Army spirit. The Italians placed their faith in the slogan La Decima Armata, the 10th Army, the idea that each soldier was a mobile fortress. They deployed Arditi, elite shock troops, equipped with folding swords, grenades, and thick cloth fragmentation vests, who struck enemy strongpoints under the cover of darkness. Soldier poet Alfredo Cramarotti wrote, "In the cold mist, the Arditi surged forward like ghosts, their fervour as unyielding as stone walls." The river-crossing operation raged for 3 chaotic days and nights, until the Austro-German command had to bring up reserve battalions from Trentino to hold the right bank. Though only a partial success, the engagement marked a turning point. The Italians no longer simply retreated, but were ready to counterattack. A respite after the storm of shells, after 3 days under relentless bombardment and heavy casualties, tens of thousands on each side. That night, when the big guns finally fell silent, soldiers from both sides laid small wood bundles along the trench edges and lit flickering flames together. Italians sang the folk song Bella Ciao. Austro-Germans responded with Wiener Blut. Then all listened in silence to the Piave's gentle flow. In that rare moment, the smell of gunpowder blended with the fragrance of riverside herbs, bringing a fleeting peace. They knew winter's icy veil would soon descend on the front, but the echo of shared humanity remained amid the desolation. The Passo Rolle mountain pass. land of wind and fire. Passo Rolle, at over 1,900 metres elevation, is the natural route linking the Primiero Valley with the High Cadore region. Under the thin late autumn snow, the wheel ruts of ammunition carts remained faintly visible. Here, Austro-German artillery emplaced 105mm guns along the cliff face, using the mountain winds to adjust their trajectories and fire down on Italian positions deep in the valley. The Italians responded by tunnelling through the steel-hard limestone. They used pneumatic drills and small explosive charges to create a tunnel system hundreds of metres long, running from their rear lines to directly beneath the Austrian blockhouses. At night, Italian sappers crept into the mountain's heart, laid heavy mines, and then raced back to the rendezvous point before the fuse's timer lamp winked. When the explosion shook the cliff, many Austrian batteries were thrown off target and forced to withdraw, opening the way for Italian infantry assaults. Col di Lana, the Hill of Blood. Not far from Passo Rolle, Col di Lana stood like a natural fortress at over 2,700 metres. From winter 1915 into early 1917, both sides laboured to tunnel through its rock and bury explosives, a supreme test of subterranean warfare. Under Italian command of General Luigi Cadorna, engineers built a tunnel nearly 1 kilometre long through the summit, with 67 explosive chambers. Each chamber held between 25 and 50. Aware of the danger, the Austro-Germans countered by digging a parallel gallery only 1.2 metres high, using crowbars and machine gun barrels to chip through and place mines to block the Italian advance. On the night of April 17th and 18th, 1917, with the snow fully melted, the two tunnels nearly converged. Only a few metres of rock separated them. The Italians detonated their massive charge, a thunderous blast that buried Col di Lana's summit under clouds of dust and rock. Hundreds of Austrian soldiers were instantly entombed, and survivors retreated in panic. Yet that moment of victory left the peak devastated, its only trace a solitary Italian flagpole rising amid the wind-swept rubble. The Field Medical Unit. Angels on high. On peaks near 2,000 metres, weather was always brutal. Scorching sun by day, skin-biting frost by night. Along that razor's edge between life and death, the nurses of Medical Rescue Unit 83, Unità Soccorso 83, set up field stations in natural rock caverns. They carried medicine bags, oil lanterns and small bells to call their comrades. When artillery roared, they pressed stethoscopes to their ears and raced across shell-pocked ground to gather the wounded. On makeshift wooden stretchers, many gripped tubes of antiseptic paste, while nurses carried mini oxygen tanks whispering, "Hold on, you'll make it home." One nurse, Maria De Luca, wrote in her diary, "Amid the snowy mist, I took the trembling hand of the young soldier, placed a mint-scented gauze over his gas burns to soothe the pain. He whispered his sister's name, asking me to call for her. I softly sang, 'O Sol Mio,' so he would not fear." Faith and song became spiritual medicine, helping many recover from the shock of those underground blasts. Survival and comradeship. Along the mountain road, both Italian and Austro-German soldiers faced dangers beyond shell fire. Frost so severe that ankles could freeze solid, canteens of water locked in ice. They learned to stave off cold by mixing wine with boiling water and sipping it slowly to restore circulation. Amid the jagged rocks, opposing sappers sometimes met while clearing mines. With no clear enemy in view, they worked together to remark safe passages, then returned to their respective tunnels. In those fleeting moments, life and the very rationale of war seemed to vanish, leaving only human solidarity in that barren wilderness. The big picture. The struggle in Trentino was not merely about seizing every metre of ground, but a contest between nature and humankind. Deep snow, biting winds, and vertical terrain. The interplay of subterranean tactics, elite engineering units, and battlefield medical teams produced strange and poignant stories, where the front line became a silent, desolate night, yet still held sparks of hope. In late 1917, as snow thickly blanketed the Western Front, the relentless roar of heavy guns at Ypres and Flanders reminded humanity of unceasing destructive power. Breathe out gently and let your mind drift to that damp land, where soldiers' footsteps pressed into icy mud, and smoke and fire waged endless battle. Ypres, the city of the martyrs. Amid poison clouds, Ypres, the ancient town of Flanders, had become a symbol of sorrow since the Germans first unleashed chlorine gas on April 22nd, 1915. Now, more than 2 years later, the town lay ghost recreated under snow, sandbag forts and makeshift trenches stretching across the plains. Yet the acrid scent of chemicals still clung to the freezing air, making every breath oppressive. Under General Herbert Plumer, the British organised the Messines counterattack in late June, but the winter of 1917 in Flanders saw only small raids, where German stormtrooper squads used snow camouflage to penetrate Allied trenches, plant mines and grenades, then melt back into the night before the enemy could react. The hiss of fuse wires and the whoosh of grenades in the snowy darkness kept soldiers awake all night, eyes straining for any shadow of the foe. Flanders, the corridor of death, and life in the freeze. The Flanders corridor, thousands of hectares of low meadows and tangled canals, became a trap of mud and stagnant water. Temperatures sometimes plunged below 10 degrees Celsius, turning the mud each morning into an invisible armoured shell. British and French troops groped their way through snow-covered barbed wire, carrying wire-cutting knives, each step as if on black velvet of cold. In the deep trenches, Allied soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand gathered around an oil lamp built into a small stove, cooking potato soup with bread scraps, sharing every scrap of salted fat. They wrapped themselves in once plush wool blankets now matted with mud, exchanging tips to stay warm, rubbing palms together, pressing them to their chests before tucking them into coat pockets, or having a comrade knead their calves to restore circulation. Soft laughter rose when someone recited a short verse about the red poppies of Flanders, a reminder not to let the cold extinguish the flame of hope. Raids and the art of ambush. At the end of December, the Germans launched their first Christmas raid. Each elite squad was ordered to slip past forward lines, destroy small trench sections, then seal dugout entrances with heat-resistant tape, waiting for Allied bombardment to fall before flinging open the doors, releasing smoke and gas grenades, and withdrawing into the darkness. It was ruthless ambushcraft, forcing the enemy to stay perpetually alert. In response, Allied artillery employed reactive fire. Immediately after each raid, they used mobile artillery radar to locate German guns and reply within 20 minutes, shattering enemy formations. Amid that shelling, alarms and shouts of "incoming" rang in chaos, then faded to the relentless staccato of bursting shells. Nurses' compassion and the poppy flower. At a field station on the trench's edge, Red Cross nurses, many from Switzerland and the United States, persisted in their work. They dressed wounds with iodine-soaked bandages, massaged frostbitten feet, and served ginger tea to the wounded. Some carried dried poppy seeds, slipping them into soldiers' pockets as a silent encouragement. Hold on to the red of life, even if the sky turns dark. That tiny poppy blossom became a symbol of solidarity. Soldiers felt a spark of spring's warmth through its red petals, and their hearts steadied as they crossed no man's land at the dead of night. The aftermath of Caporetto and the Second Piave. Line. On October 24, 1917, the Austro-German forces under General von Below shattered the Italian defensive line at Caporetto, forcing them to retreat far back to the right bank of the Piave. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were overwhelmed, and thousands of artillery pieces and machine guns were left on the battlefield. Thereafter, the Italian government, led by Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando and Chief of Staff Armando Diaz swiftly restructured the army, replenished troops from the southern provinces, and intensified training along the new Sacred Way, Voie Sacrée. By early spring 1918, the right bank of the Piave had become a steel bulwark, deep trenches, machine gun nests, thick coils of barbed wire, and minefields buried beneath the shallows of the river marked every yard. Each ammunition dump and every stone barricade bore the names of the previous year's sacrifices, a vow never to allow the enemy to step there again. The surprise power of the French tanks. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, French arms manufacturers had upgraded a number of Renault FT tanks, the first light tank equipped with a 360-degree rotating turret. On the night of January 4th, 1918, a battalion of the 1st Tank Division was transported by train to Montello, the small foothill overlooking the Piave. At dawn, the FTs roared to life, their treads cutting through snow as they headed toward the Austro-German positions across the river. Supported by 75mm field guns, the French tanks surged up the sandy bank, crushing barbed wire and overrunning exposed machine gun emplacements. The Austro-German troops were stunned by these 8-ton steel monsters with their turret-mounted guns and caterpillar tracks. Within hours, riverbank strongpoints were driven back, opening a gap for the Italian Allied infantry to storm across and retake ground. The spirit of the Piave Spring. In February 1918, the slogan Piave Spring, Primavera del Piave, spread along the defensive line. Every Italian soldier, including freshly conscripted recruits, adopted the philosophy, hold today so we may attack tomorrow. They carried brass instruments, small drums and the tricolour flag bundled to their chests as they passed each fortified marker. With the support of improved Italian artillery and additional French tanks, 50 more FTs sent from the west, the official counteroffensive began on March 15th. Teams of tanks, RDT infantry shock troops, and artillery closely coordinated. As soon as a machine gun nest was crushed, Italian infantry surged forward, tossing smoke grenades and firing pistols into dugouts. Shouts of "Avanti Italia!" echoed along the riverbank, sending the defenders reeling. Life on the spring front. Though the heavy snow had ceased, early spring Piave remained damp and cold, with morning mists hanging like curtains over the trenches. Soldiers donned extra woolen sweaters and fur caps, yet the air still bit. Each morning they shared hot iron ration tins, fried rice, canned meat and lentil soup, meals that warmed both body and heart as thoughts turned to their homeland's liberation. The Italian sapper units had become the tank cavalry. They crawled behind the tank tracks, repaired broken treads, replaced worn rubber pads, and fitted extra shrapnel-proof armour plates to the front. Sapper Alfredo Rossi recalled, "At dawn, I saw the first FT smash through a gun emplacement, then the whole line poured forward. I will never forget the cheer of my comrades when the basket of hot bread arrived right behind the tanks." Initial gains and extended hope. In just 3 days, the Italian Allied forces recaptured 5 kilometres of riverbank, liberating villages such as Navesa and Cavasso. General Diaz declared over the wireless, "We have shown that when fighting spirit unites with new technology, no enemy can forever seal the Piave." Yet both sides knew this was only the beginning of the Piave Spring. The Austro-Germans were hastily bringing back heavy artillery, reinforcing their defences, and deploying more observation aircraft. That night, the martial music returned, but so did whispered hopes of peace on the horizon, among soldiers who had bought British newspapers at the front. Across the muddy fields beside the Piave River, heading toward the town of Vittorio Veneto, the site where the fate of the Austro-Italian front would be decided in early 1918. Departing with the 1st Tank Regiment, in the pre-dawn chill of March 20th, 1918, the frost-nipped faces of the sapper crews and tank drivers lit up with excitement. Together, they inspected every detail of their Renault FT, the steel tracks liberally oiled, spare rubber-lined road wheels in place, the driver's seat and headlamp glowing in the mist. The 1st Tank Regiment, organised into 3 battalions, emerged from their dugouts one by one, crawling toward Vittorio Veneto, the key point in the Austro-German defensive line. As a pale rosy dawn broke, the tracked vehicles rumbled over a makeshift causeway, erected by Italian artillery, spanning the Piave's shallow bank. Below the bridge, the river's emerald waters swirled around thousands of gleaming rounds, as if bearing witness to this historic moment. Battle at the town gate. At the western foot of Vittorio Veneto, Austro-German field guns had arrayed minefields and 75mm mortars. The command whistle blew, and the FTs formed a V-shaped wedge, crushing through a section of barbed wire previously cut by Italian sappers. As the tracks crushed the final strand, the regiment fanned out to both flanks, forcing the enemy guns to pivot. Simultaneously, Italian 75mm and 60mm batteries opened a preparatory barrage on the machine gun emplacements atop the hill. The thunder of explosions shook the ground, dust clouds blotting out the line of sight. The 1st FT lunged forward, its steel glacis tearing into the concrete emplacement and snapping the breech block off its mount. Austro-German crewmen inside panicked, firing pistols through the slits. But it was too late. Immediately afterward, the Arditi infantry regiment advanced, hurling smoke grenades to screen their assault and storming the horizontal dugouts, clearing each steel door in turn. The Italian flag fluttered atop the captured Austro-German gun position, a portent of the decisive battle to come. Guarding the sky, Italian-French anti-aircraft artillery. While the ground battle raged, the skies above saw aerial skirmishes. The Italian-French anti-aircraft batteries, armed with Beaufort's 37mm guns and QF 2-pounders mounted on concrete emplacements, swept the air over Vittorio Veneto. Austro-German reconnaissance aircraft darted back and forth, attempting to photograph the exposed tanks and gun positions. A flight of Italian Nieuport 17 fighters rose to provide cover, taking ammunition from the ground, then looping in a diving attack to shoot down 2 Albatros D3 scouts. The subdued roar of shattered airplane engines mingled with the boom of anti-aircraft bursts, granting precious moments of calm for the tank regiment surging forward. Clash on San Marco Hill. Having secured the western slopes, the regiment pressed on to assault San Marco Hill, the commanding height overlooking Vittorio Veneto's centre. The rocky, muddy ascent became a maze for tanks. Several FTs became bogged down, their tracks slipping on the slick clay. Yet thanks to sapper detachments hauling replacement tracks and bolting on steel reinforcement bars, the column finally reached the ridge. From San Marco's summit battery, Italian artillery laid precise fire onto the town below. A salvo of 65mm rounds shattered battlements and towers, their impact shaking the earth like miniature earthquakes. Austro-German trenches dissolved beneath blast dust as Italian infantry poured in, closing the encirclement. The moment of triumph. Amid the cacophony, when the first iron gate of the northern ramparts collapsed, Italian soldiers surged forward, their cheers echoing across the heights. French tanks and anti-aircraft guns joined the celebration with their own salvos, each boom sounding like fireworks. In that moment, every soldier, every engineer, every nurse in the rear felt the warm joy of victory. Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Leclerc, tall, with bright eyes, grasped the sapper's elbow beside him, his heart pounding like the tank tracks tearing through mud. "We did it! We really did it!" Caring for the wounded and honouring glory. Immediately after the victory, a mobile field hospital was established at the hill's base. Nurses worked urgently to treat fractured limbs, track crusher burns, and severe explosive injuries. They mixed sulfonamide powder with warm water, applied it to wounds, and wrapped clean dressings tightly. The whir of suturing machines in the dugout sounded like the heartbeat of hope. Nearby, a wooden frame was erected bearing the inscription, Vittorio Veneto Spring Victory, 20th March 1918, along with the names of the units involved. 1st Tank Regiment, 5th RDT Division, Italian-French Anti-Aircraft Battery, and the Field Medical Corps. This became an indelible mark in the annals of the war, entering a new phase of the Great War. The triumph at Vittorio Veneto reverberated across the entire Entente and Italy. News flew to Paris, London, and New York, where newspapers hailed Italy's vigorous resurgence and the unstoppable power of tanks. Yet both sides understood that the war was not over. Austro-German command was rushing reinforcements from the Eastern Front and procuring additional 88mm guns. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing a broad spring offensive in April, featuring British Mark V tanks and 15-inch heavy artillery. Thus, the stage was set for the next great chapter of the global conflict, the Champagne battlefield context. As the summer grain harvest came to a close, the Champagne fields appeared dreamlike in the autumn sun. Endless rows of vineyards, oak woods lining the streams, and low rolling mounds. But that pastoral beauty was only a mask. Beneath the thin soil lay the Central Powers' fortified trench system, weaving together the Lassigny and Bois-Belleau ridges down to the Marne River. After the victory at Vittorio Veneto, the Allies, leveraging the powerful firepower of British-French tanks and heavy artillery, decided to launch a fall offensive before winter's chill returned. Their goal was to break the German defensive line on the Champagne Plateau and open the way into eastern France. Preparations for the Champagne autumn. On September 25, 1918, over 1,000 guns, 155 5mm French howitzers, 75 mm American field guns, and British 6-inch pieces, opened fire in unison for 48 consecutive hours. Artillery shells smashed the first trench line, flattened machine gun emplacements, and churned earth and rock into chaos. Under General Ferdinand Foch's joint command, French and American infantry quietly crawled to the edge of no man's land, readying themselves for the attack order. Behind them, battalions of British Mark V and American Renault FT tanks massed, poised to coordinate with the infantry. The American sapper detachments, mostly young immigrants fresh from across the Atlantic, swiftly cut through meters of barbed wire, laid demolition charges to breach trenches, and cleared lanes for the tanks and foot soldiers. September 28, 1918. Attack order. At 0500 hours, machine gun whistles shrieked in unison with the rolling barrage, clearing each successive sector. Beneath the smoke, more than 200,000 US doughboys and French troops surged over stubble fields toward the Champagne Plateau. Stars and stripes and tricolore flags fluttered in the mist. British Mark V tanks lumbered forward, crushing the final strands of barbed wire, then pivoted their 6-pounder guns to each flank to destroy German machine gun nests. Groups of American infantry followed close under the tank skirts, tossing smoke grenades into dugouts before storming in with their SMGs. Shouts of "Liberté" and "Vive la France" rang out across the fields. The Saint-Mihiel operation, the desert fortress, removed. A few days after Champagne, the Americans immediately committed one tank division and one mechanized infantry brigade to smash through the Saint-Mihiel salient, a system of fortified hills the Germans had held since 1914, around the town of Saint-Mihiel on the Meuse River. On September 12th, before the American Revolution formally began, SEC, 550 US and French aircraft bombarded German underground shelters, makeshift airfields, and supply depots for 4 continuous hours. When the bombardment ended, 260 Renault FT tanks and 80 brand new US M1917 Liberty tanks and export model Mark IV roared into the red mud roads. The tanks formed a flying V formation in 3 waves, threading between blockhouses before swinging to strike the enemy rear. US infantry moved quickly, using M1917 rifles and Mach-2 grenades to clear pillboxes. By afternoon, the entire Saint-Mihiel position had fallen, freeing 35,000 German troops trapped in the pocket. The role of mobile artillery, French M1897 75mm guns on motorized tractors, and American M1918 155 howitzers provided thunderous support. They used mobile radio sets to communicate directly with tanks and infantry, adjusting fire on the move. Each 75mm barrage landed just 200 pounds to 300 metres ahead of the advancing troops, promptly neutralising any new resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Henri Dubois, who helped deploy the shortwave mobile radar sets, recalled, "When I heard a just fire 50 metres left over the radio, I knew we were making history. Mobile artillery like this had never existed before." Pride and loss. On the final night of the counterattack, American and French soldiers planted flags atop the hills around Saint-Mihiel, embraced as they shared hardtack and their last pieces of chocolate. Though joyful, they still dreamed of peace. Many softly sang the Star-Spangled Banner or La Marseillaise by moonlight, pledging tomorrow will be calmer. But behind the victory lay thousands of fallen comrades. They carved their names onto a wooden memorial board beside the mobile aid station, so that any passing ambulance bearing the dead would pause and observe a moment of silence before moving on. In northern France in late autumn 1918, where the La Malmaison offensive and the Oise-Eisner fortress battle were opening new chapters of mechanised warfare, at the same time the first war correspondents, with rudimentary cameras and phonograph recorders, quietly documented every hardship, tracking the treads of tanks and the plumes of artillery smoke, preparing for the La Malmaison offensive. On October 23, 1918, General Foch ordered the launch of the La Malmaison operation, aiming to seize the last German forts and strongpoints on the Ailette Plateau, thereby securing Paris and the Western Supply Rail Line. A week earlier, French 155mm batteries, British 8-inch guns, and American 240mm howitzers had simultaneously dug skybursts, placing deep charges of TNT beneath enemy lines. French sapper units, now equipped with crude vibrating seismographs, located the enemy's underground galleries. They buried hundreds of tons of TNT, more than 10 metres deep, creating a zone of chaos just before the assault. In drizzly night, they silently crossed no man's land, emplaced their fuses, then withdrew to staging positions. The Battle of La Malmaison, the artillery earthquake. On the morning of October 27th, under light rain, the rolling barrage began. Thousands of 155mm shells thundered onto the La Malmaison strongpoint. Within minutes, the ground shook like a minor earthquake. When the smoke cleared, over 30 machine gun nests lay in ruins. Mark V tanks and Renault FTs advanced in concert. The slim FTs slipped through the rubble, overrunning German infantry, unable to organise a counterstrike. A squad of Italian Arditi, brought in for support, threw smoke grenades into the bunkers, then stormed the concrete casemates where German troops huddled. The French tricolour fluttered from the cracked stone walls of La Malmaison. The Oise-Eisner fortress, the final armour line. Immediately after La Malmaison, the Allies shifted east to the Oise-Eisner fortress, a 25-kilometre-long horseshoe of defences. Built in 1916 on a wind-blasted plateau, its concrete walls were up to 4 metres thick, with machine gun emplacements shielded by steel plating. British mechanised artillery deployed 12-inch demolition guns, each shell nearly 900 kilo, capable of punching through the concrete walls. Meanwhile, de Havilland DH-4 reconnaissance planes equipped with cameras patrolled the skies, sending hourly photographic updates to the rear command. On November 5th, after 48 hours of intense shelling, Mark V tanks in leopard formation charged, their tracks crushing barbed wire, their armour pierced with holes from concrete fragments. American and French mechanised infantry followed closely, capturing every ammunition pit and underground command post. When the last fort fell, more than 20,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. War correspondents, the first eyes and ears. Amid the smoke and fire, reporters and photographers, like Henry Montfort of Le Figaro and John Jack Harrison of the Associated Press rode alongside the tanks, crouching to shoot through periscopes. They carried crude Edison phonograph recorders to capture the blasts of orders, the roar of shells, even cries of Vive la France and Liberty. The night after the German lines broke, Harrison recorded, "The growl of the Mark V boomed like thunder, followed by the pounding boots of infantry over the rubble. It was the image of liberation made real." Their dispatches and images, sent to Paris and New York, gave the world its first vivid glimpse of modern mechanized warfare, through both sight and sound, life and recovery after victory. After Oyser-Eisner, Allied troops fell back to reserve lines. A supply station was set up on the new railway along the Eisner, bringing food, warm clothing, and medical supplies forward. Mobile nurses brewed ginger tea, distributed thin slices of bread and chocolate, and cared for men suffering stress after the great bombardment. Under a quiet sky, Montfort and Harrison captured a rare moment. French soldiers singing La Marseillaise by moonlight, American troops strumming mandolins and singing When Johnny Comes Marching Home. Their hurried Edison recordings became priceless documents of soldiers' spirits amid the guns, the turning point toward peace. Just days after the victories at La Malmaison and the Oise-Eisner fortress, Austria-Hungary on the Italian front surrendered, and Germany entered negotiations for withdrawal to its borders. The New York Times and Le Figaro ran banner headlines, "Endgame approaches." On November 11th, the Armistice of Compiègne officially ended the First World War. Russia descends into chaos after the October Revolution. As the violence on the European battlefields gradually subsided, Russia plunged ever deeper into turmoil. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks under Lenin overthrew the provisional government and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk to withdraw from the Great War. But almost immediately, the vast empire split into two camps: the Whites, anti-Bolsheviks, and the Reds, Bolshevik supporters. In Petrograd, Moscow, and across the central provinces, the population divided into factions. Detachments of Red Guards and People's Army units successively besieged and seized prisons and aristocratic mansions, even seizing control of the press and arms factories. In many rural regions, authority fell to provisional revolutionary committees. Wherever leadership was lacking, local Red Guards formed their own proletarian dictatorship committees. Allied intervention, the North Russia Campaign. Fearing that Soviet withdrawal from the front would allow Germany to redeploy its forces, Britain, France, and the United States decided to intervene. In the summer of 1918, the Royal Navy landed a small force at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, alongside American and French troops. Their initial goal was to secure ammunition depots and prevent weapons from falling into German hands, then to support white forces fighting the Bolsheviks. At Murmansk, summer was no longer freezing, but persistent rain and wind soaked the ground. British soldiers encamped beside the arms warehouses, receiving daily rations of stale bread, canned meat and black tea. They mapped the railroad routes in preparation for a march southward to confront General Yudenich's White Northern Army, the Siberian Front, Vladivostok, and the American Expeditionary Force. Meanwhile, in the Far East, American troops under General Graves landed at Vladivostok. The port city emerged in the early morning mist as the vital link between the Pacific and the Trans-Siberian Railway. Trains arriving from the Far East carried food, electrical generators, and 75 new field guns. Along the Siberian Railway, American soldiers, mostly young Midwesterners, patrolled stations to protect Allied arms shipments. Occasionally they encountered Red Guard guerrillas who ambushed the tracks with grenades before melting away. The American Expeditionary Force had to coordinate closely with Czech Legion units and local white forces to open and secure supply lines westward. The Bolshevik home front in crisis. While Allied forces appeared in the north and east, the Soviet government faced a food crisis and popular uprisings. US advisor Herbert Hoover dispatched the American Relief Administration to Moscow and Petrograd, distributing rice, flour and lard. Bread lines stretched for a kilometre. People in tatters queued with swollen, frost-bitten hands. In Kazan and Samara, Red Army regiments under Trotsky used armoured trains to push through combat zones against Siberian White Guard forces. The blast of steam whistles announced arriving locomotives at each station, and the roar of artillery mingled with the smell of coal smoke and engine oil. Strategic links. The Whites and Allied support. Allied contingents, British in the north, Americans in the Far East, French around Arkhangelsk, lacked direct coordination, but all backed the Russian Whites against the Soviets. They supplied ammunition, trained officers, and exploited rail lines for transport. General Yudenich in Estonia mobilised horse-drawn wagons, armoured cars, and light artillery, advancing to Petrograd's gates before suffering fierce Red Army counterattacks. In Siberia, General Kolchak faced betrayal by local commanders, leading to the collapse of the White movement in Vladivostok when Allied forces withdrew. The morale of soldiers and civilians. Allied soldiers from Britain, France, the United States, Australia and Canada now faced a different front. No longer deep trenches and machine guns, but chaos, the disarmament of Russian troops, and an inability to distinguish friend from foe. Many felt lost in Siberia's icy plains, homesickness stretching thousands of kilometres away. Russian civilians focused on finding a piece of bread or a boiled potato and maintaining a semblance of family warmth in temporary shacks. They read Allied newspapers, saw Western correspondents' photographs of triumphant Paris, and wondered, will peace ever come here? The birth of the Soviet Republic. Amid the fighting and foreign intervention, Lenin and the Bolshevik Central Committee resolved to consolidate their power. They formed the Northeast Front to counter White forces in Estonia, while ramping up production of light arms, the Mosin Nagant rifle and Fedorov submachine gun, for the Red Army. In Moscow, Soviet leaders promulgated Russia's first Soviet Republic constitution, paving the way for the later Soviet Union. Pravda splashed its front page with the headline, "The Revolution's Irrevocable Victory." The guns at Saint-Mihiel, or the Piave, now echoed only in memory, replaced by the slogans "Proletarian Self-Determination" and "Peace Land, Food." Perm, the Northern Gateway, and the White Guard counterattack Perm, an industrial city on the edge of the Urals, was once the centre for manufacturing locomotives and weapons for the Russian Empire. In May 1918, General Kolchak, the supreme ruler of the East, organised a counterattack to retake Perm, hoping to regain control of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Over 10,000 White Guard soldiers, equipped with light field guns and armoured trains, were divided into two assault columns from the west and the south. The fighting raged fiercely on the edge of the Taiga forest. In the spring mist, the first armoured train thundered across the bridge over the Kama River, destroying a Bolshevik machine gun nest on the far bank. At the same time, White Guard infantry besieged the main station, using smoke grenades to block the tracks. But the Red Army, under the command of General Budyonny, timely brought up horse-drawn light artillery for reinforcement, and their return fire forced the counter-attacking train to halt. That night, both sides chased each other through small stations, the blast of locomotive whistles mingling with shouted orders echoing among the pine trees. The White Guard's armoured train, though protected by 10mm of steel plating, could not withstand the Red Army's 76mm artillery barrage. When the mist lifted, Perm remained in Bolshevik hands. Irkutsk, land of exile and contention. Irkutsk, the city on the shores of Lake Baikal, had become the exile capital for many nobles and imperial officers. In July 1918, Kolchak deployed a special operations force to the railway station to stage a coup, hoping to open the route southward to Vladivostok. Czechoslovak reconnaissance aircraft, old Sopwith Camels, flew over Lake Baikal to report Bolshevik positions. However, the Red Army, supported by local Cossack forces and Mongolian guerrillas, had already encircled the station. The battle lasted 3 days, amid machine gun fire and the howling wind off the lake. When 120mm mortar shells rained down on the fuel depot, the White Guard's armoured train became trapped on shattered tracks. Over 5,000 of Kolchak's soldiers were taken prisoner, and the remainder were forced to flee into the deep forest to escape. The execution of the Tsar, the final turning point. News of the failure at Perm reached Omsk, the White government's former capital, and shattered Kolchak's momentum. Meanwhile, in Yekaterinburg, the Soviet Special Commission, Cheka, under Dzerzhinsky's direction, carried out a historic decision: the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and the entire Romanov family. On the night of July 17, 1918, the Tsar, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children were led into the stone cellar of the Ipatiev house. By flickering lamplight and amid the smell of gunpowder, they were shot in silence. The next day's issue of Izvestia carried only a single brief line: the Tsar has abandoned the final throne. This event ended the Romanov dynasty after more than 3 centuries and struck both the white and red factions with unspeakable horror. Formation of the Soviet Federative State. Amid the smoke and fire of the Civil War, Lenin and the Party Central Committee strove to consolidate a federal model. On July 30th, 1918, the Soviets adopted the first Union of Soviet Socialist Republics law, paving the way for the creation of the Federation of Soviet Republics, from Ukraine to Central Asia. The Red Army under Trotsky simultaneously launched counteroffensives, recapturing railway lines and seizing power plants and food depots in Kazan, Samara, and Perm. Their armoured trains, supported by motorised horse-drawn units and fierce Cossack cavalry, gradually turned the tide of the Civil War. The home front and civilians. In the rear, life remained wretched. The Soviet Special Commission tightly controlled food distribution, employing war communism, confiscating grain from peasants and allocating it according to production quotas. Western correspondents like Florence Leach of the Daily Telegraph recorded scenes of people queuing for bread and canned meat, their eyes distant and weary after years of war and revolution. Survivors of the Romanov family, such as the rumoured Grand Duchess Anastasia, hid under White Guard protection before fleeing abroad. Her story became a legend, inspiring hope that one day peace would bring her back to her ancestral homeland. The final counterattack of the White Army. After their defeats at Perm and Irkutsk, the remnants of the White forces under Generals Denikin and Yudenich clustered along the Sea of Azov coast and around Petrograd. In November 1918, they received trickles of aid from Britain and France, light artillery and a few military advisors. But when the Allies began withdrawing their troops home, the White Army lost its crucial supply line. In the bitter winter cold, Denikin launched the Don Region campaign, mobilising Cossack cavalry, infantry, and a battalion of improvised armoured cars along the Don River's banks, hoping to strike at the Soviet rear. They captured several small railway stations but proved too weak to hold against the Red Army's coordinated firepower, 76mm guns, Maxim machine guns, and Trotsky's armoured train detachments. After just 10 days, the campaign ground to a halt. Denikin withdrew to Novorossiysk and then evacuated to England. The Kronstadt Rebellion and the voice of the naval infantry. Meanwhile, on the Kronstadt Peninsula, the lungs of Petrograd, the naval infantry units that had once helped the Bolsheviks seize power, rose up in early 1921 against a policy of war communism. They mustered nearly 16,000 soldiers and demanded free Soviet elections, freedom of the press, and end to peasant repression. On February 28, 1921,
the Red Guard under Mikhail Tukhachevsky besieged and bombarded the Kronstadt fortress with heavy artillery and first art tanks. After 2 days, Fort Peter and Fort Constantine fell. Thousands were arrested, many leaders executed. This event confirmed that the Soviet Union would brook no opposition, even from its own naval forces, when class struggle was deemed paramount over all freedoms. The new economic policy, NEP, found the turning point in Reconstruction. As the brutal civil war cooled, Lenin recognised that socialist war had achieved its goal, but that war communism had impoverished the peasants and crippled industrial output. At the end of 1921, the 10th Soviet Congress adopted the new economic policy, NEP, permitting small private businesses, allowing peasants to keep a portion of their produce, and restoring a domestic market. NEP quickly bore fruit. Bread reappeared on Petrograd's bakery shelves. Moscow's machine works resumed at 60% of pre-war capacity, and private cooperatives sprang up across the Soviet Union. Yet it also revealed internal divisions. The far left, represented by Trotsky and Bukharin, argued that NEP was a retreat. This debate laid the groundwork for the power struggles that would later unfold among Stalin, Trotsky, and their rivals. Founding of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, on December 30th, 19... Delegates from the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian, Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani republics met in Moscow and signed the Treaty on the Creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Chairman Lenin, despite his failing health, declared, "We are no longer disjointed fragments. The Soviet Union is the work of the proletariat of all nations." The hammer and sickle flag unfurled across Lubyanka Square, replacing the Tsarist emblem. The national anthem, Invincible and Happy Republic, the post-coronation march, rang out, closing the chapter from Tsarist autocracy to a workers' and peasants' government. The White Guard's do-or-die counter-offensive. After 2 successive defeats at Perm and Irkutsk, the White Guard forces under Generals Anton Denikin and Pyotr Wrangel clustered along the Sea of Azov coast. As the Allies gradually withdrew their troops, Denikin decided on a small-scale attack from the Rostov corridor, hoping to open a route down to Crimea. However, the Red Army under General Mikhail Frunze held firm, organising deep trench lines and reinforcing with armoured trains. In mid-October 1919, a White Guard armoured train crossed the Don River Bridge, carrying 76mm guns and a Cossack cavalry contingent. They captured several small stations, but lacking supplies, their ammunition stocks quickly ran out. The Red Army launched a swift counterattack, using mobile artillery and Maxim machine guns to block the withdrawal route. Denikin was forced to postpone the campaign and retreat into the North Caucasus, leaving eastern Russia in Soviet hands. The Kronstadt Rebellion, an internal purge. At the same time, the spring of 1921 saw the Kronstadt Naval Infantry, who had stood alongside the Bolsheviks in 1917, rise up demanding free Soviet elections and an end to the dictatorship of the proletariat. They repeated the slogan, "No bread, no war," but this time with their guns raised against the new government. After 2 days of fighting, the Red Guards under Tukhachevsky used 120mm artillery and British-supplied Mark V tanks to encircle the fortress and carry out a brutal purge. The rebels were executed, signalling that the Soviet regime was ready to use violence even against former allies. Declaration of the NEP and the shaping of the Soviet state. Under internal pressure and economic crisis, Lenin launched the New Economic Policy, NEP, at the end of 1921, scaling back nationalisation, allowing small private business and letting peasants keep their produce. NEP both rescued the economy and laid the foundation for state-private relations in the USSR.
In 1922, after fully suppressing uprisings and stabilizing the Civil War, the Soviet Congress approved the treaty on the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, comprising Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia. The hammer and sickle flag flew over Red Square, marking the start of a new era. Legacy and revival. The Trans-Siberian Railway was restored, the Ural arms factories resumed operation, and agricultural cooperatives in Ukraine sprouted fresh green fields. Photographers John Reed and Marguerite Harrison left the Soviet Union with 10 days that shook the world, and their Kronstadt dispatches, helping the world understand the multicoloured revolution of the Russian people. Springtime in Paris, 1919, where the Grand Palaces and the Champs-Élysées were preparing to welcome Europe's leaders to the peace conference. This marked the beginning of the continent's post-Great War reconstruction. Paris abuzz. Before the conference, in March 1919, Paris shone under warm sunlight. On Place de la Concorde, crowds jostled to watch horse-drawn carriages carrying delegations from Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. Gare du Nord received the train bearing Woodrow Wilson, Georges Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Vittorio Orlando. All appeared weary from the war, yet their eyes held firm determination for Europe's future. Launching the conference, the Round Table, on January 18, the conference officially opened at the Palace of Versailles. Beneath the rows of white columns, delegates sat around the long round table, draped in red silk, where draft peace treaties and border maps lay. Clemenceau began, "France must have lasting security. Germany must never be allowed to wage war again." Wilson pressed his hand to his chest and spoke of his 14 points on national self-determination and a common security organisation, suggesting the creation of a League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. Shaping the new map, subsidiary committees met for days. German-French border, the Vosges passes and the Moselle Valley returned to France. Alsace-Lorraine was officially restored. New independent states. Poland secured the Polish corridor, linking the Baltic to Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary separated from Austria-Hungary. Reparations. Germany was compelled to pay enormous sums in instalments, forcing a future economic restructuring. Failures and disagreements. Although Wilson yearned for lasting peace, Clemenceau remained wary that Germany must not be allowed to deceive us again. Lloyd George skillfully stood between, maintaining the alliance with France while hoping Britain's economy would revive through trade with Germany. Orlando of Italy demanded the Dalmatian coast along the Adriatic, but faced Yugoslav objections. Tense negotiations dragged on, and late-night sessions became routine, signing the Treaty of Versailles. On June 28, 1919, the 5th anniversary of Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, the delegations reconvened in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Under glittering crystal chandeliers, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Orlando, and Wilson all signed. Opposite them, Germany's representative, Kurt von Hohenlohe, was forced to sign without negotiating rights. They left the hall in stifling silence, carrying away a pact that would shock history. Public reaction. As news of the signing spread, Parisians erupted in celebration. Fireworks from the Eiffel Tower, hats thrown into the streets. In Berlin, the newspapers fell silent, and citizens queued mournfully for bread. In Prague, hundreds of thousands shouted, "Long, live Czechoslovakia," while in Warsaw, red and white flags fluttered. The Treaty of Sèvres and the fate of the Ottoman Empire. On August the 10th, 1920, Allied naval and diplomatic representatives and the Ottoman government convened at Sèvres, just outside Paris. On the conference table lay a map of Asia Minor, its regions demarcated, the Aegean coast awarded to Greece, Cilicia set aside for France, the Mosul oil fields handed to Britain, and central Anatolia carved into autonomous zones for Armenians and Kurds. Mustafa Kemal a young Turkish general, was not invited, but he had already summoned the Ankara parliament and launched the National Liberation Movement. His forces swiftly reclaimed northeastern Anatolia, forcing the Sèvres Commission to suspend implementation at once. The Polish-Ukrainian crisis. On the Galician plains, the old eastern territories of Austria-Hungary, Poland and the newly established Ukrainian National Republic, the Directory, clashed violently. In January 1919, General Józef Piłsudski's Polish troops swept into Lemberg, Lviv, then advanced on Kiev. By April, the Ukrainian government under Simon Petliura marshalled local Cossacks to hold the line at the Zbruch River. The Paris conference appointed a special committee, but because its priority lay with Germany-Austria and the Ottoman question, the stalemate dragged on. The decisive battle came in autumn 1919, when Polish forces won the Battle of Warsaw, seizing the strategic initiative and causing Kiev to change hands 3 times. By early 1920, Galicia's border was set along the Curzon line, splitting it into western Polish and eastern Ukrainian zones. The partition of the Middle East, the Mandate. Dotted lines. Concurrently, the conference drew the final death knell for the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Britain received the mandates for Palestine and Iraq, France the mandates for Syria and Lebanon. The Sykes-Picot scheme lines were realised on the map. From Jerusalem and Aqaba to Baghdad and Aleppo, new territories were delineated in blue ink on white parchment. In Damascus and Beirut, popular hopes for Arab independence ran high, but British and French forces patrolled the streets in armoured cars, enforcing identity registrations and dividing households. Slogans like "Freedom for Syria" and "No orders from Paris" were suppressed by the Mandate police. Many Arab intellectuals reluctantly postponed their dreams, waiting instead for a later national day. The Treaty of Lausanne, Kemal's victory. Ultimately, Mustafa Kemal's national liberation movement prevailed. On July 24, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed at Montreux Palace in Switzerland. This new agreement discarded most of Sèvres's provisions. Turkey retained all of Anatolia and eastern Thrace, ceding only Imbros and Tenedos Islands. Allied troops withdrew from Istanbul, and Mustafa Kemal became the head of the newly founded Republic of Turkey. Aftermath and seeds of new conflict. The Paris decisions gave birth to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. But the borders did not align with actual ethnic distributions. Kurds were scattered among Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Armenians lost western Armenia, and Jewish immigration into Palestine began. Immediately, settlement disputes flared. Jewish-Arab clashes in Jerusalem in the early 1920s, Cossack-Ukrainian protests in Galicia, and Polish-Czech border skirmishes in Teschen. The League of Nations was founded in 1920 with a Mandate Oversight Committee, but lacking enforcement powers it could not fully extinguish these smouldering conflicts. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria. On September 10, 1919, at the Palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, on the outskirts of Paris, representatives of the Entente and Austria, the successor state to Austria-Hungary, signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain. According to its terms, Austria lost Galicia, Bukovina, and South Tyrol, most of which became territory of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Italy. Austria's army was limited to a maximum of 30,000 men, and it was forbidden to have an air force or navy. The League of Nations was to supervise the demolition of the fort at Kronstadt and the dismantling of fortifications along the Italian border. In Vienna, the public was stunned to hear that Austria would be reduced to just over 6 million people and stripped of its heavy industry regions. In Vienna's cafes, people called the treaty the Vertrag der Schande, the Treaty of Shame, the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary. Just 1 week later, on June 4, 1920, Hungarian representatives met at the Trianon Palace in Versailles. Under its provisions, Hungary lost 72% of its former territory, Slovakia, and Carpathian Ruthenia became part of Czechoslovakia, Croatia, Slovenia joined Yugoslavia, and Transylvania was awarded to Romania. Hungary's army was limited to 35,000 troops, and it was not allowed to have a navy. Hungary had to pay war reparations to Romania and Czechoslovakia. In Budapest, intellectuals organised the Night of Trianon. Lights were extinguished, and candles were lit throughout the city as a symbol of national mourning. The journalist Bela Zsolt of the old Arpad family recorded in his diary, "We wept for our small country and for the roots that had been severed." The Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria. On November 27, 1919, Bulgaria signed the Treaty of Neuilly at Neuilly-sur-Seine. Its main points: Bulgaria ceded southern Dobruja to Romania, Macedonia to Yugoslavia, and a small section around Thessaloniki to Greece. Bulgaria's army was limited to 20,000 men. It had to open the port of Varna to British and French commercial vessels. Bulgaria was required to pay £90 million in war reparations. In Sofia, young demonstrators rallied in what they called the Neuilly disaster, painting slogans on walls. "Our father's land cannot be torn apart." Minority policies in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The newly founded Czechoslovakia, 1918, comprising Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and Carpathian Ruthenia, under the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon, was obliged to guarantee rights for the German-speaking Bohemians, approximately 3 million, the Hungarians in southern Slovakia, the Ruthenians of Carpathian Ruthenia. Prague's government enacted a minority rights law, allowing instruction in mother tongues, the establishment of cultural associations, and representation in local councils. In practice, however, tensions arose. The Sudeten Germans demanded greater autonomy, and their leader Konrad Henlein initiated the Golden Tag, Golden Day demonstrations calling for a federal structure. In the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which included Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia, the South Slavs were also diverse. Croats and Slovenes made up only about 30% of the population. Yet power remained concentrated in Belgrade. The government formed a National Reconciliation Committee, but struggles between the central Serbian establishment and the Adriatic peoples smouldered and would later erupt. Legacies of statehood and cultural revival. The subordinate treaties of Saint-Germain, Trianon, and Neuilly reshaped Central Europe. Austria became a landlocked republic, tied culturally to the old Austria-Hungary. Hungary, once the Puszta Empire, lost over 2/3 of its territory and became a landlocked state. Bulgaria, formerly Germany's ally, had to pivot to Balkan cooperation. Although minorities suffered losses, many cultural movements and national musical works experienced a revival. The Vienna Philharmonic performed Bela Bartok's Symphony Trianon Triumph. The writer Franz Werfel published stories of the Sudeten Germans, warning future generations. The League of Nations is born, the World Senate. On January 10th, 1920, the Covenant of the League of Nations officially took effect in Geneva. 42 founding states, including Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Argentina and Brazil, but not yet the United States, committed to resolve international disputes through diplomacy, economic sanctions, or collective action, rather than unilateral force. The League's headquarters was established at the Palais Wilson on the shores of Lake Geneva. Each week, delegates met in the council chamber to discuss mandates overseeing elections in newly separated territories, settle the Greece-Bulgaria border dispute, and supervise the mandate for Palestine. English and French rang out regularly, creating the solemn yet welcoming atmosphere of a World Senate. The Palestine Mandate and the Jewish Question. Under the League's oversight, Britain administered the Palestine Mandate in accordance with the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Jewish immigrants from Europe and Russia streamed in. Kibbutzim, collective farms, were founded across Galilee. Meanwhile, the local Arab community grew increasingly alarmed at the prospect of a Jewish state. In 1921, the League convened the Peel Commission to investigate Palestine's situation. Its report proposed partitioning the territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, but this plan was rejected by both sides. It marked the beginning of the century-long Arab-Jewish conflict. Asian independence movements. At the same time in Asia, former colonial peoples also yearned for freedom. India. Under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, the non-violent Satyagraha movement spearheaded the 1930 Salt March, but its roots lay in the 1920 salt tax protest as part of the larger campaign for self-rule. Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru advocated peace with Britain while refusing to submit to the salt monopoly. China. After the 1919 May 4th movement, Beijing students rallied for national rejuvenation and the May 4th uprising. From that sprang both the Kuomintang Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, later adversaries in China's civil war. Vietnam. Under French colonial rule, leaflets carried Nguyen Ai Quoc's Ho Chi Minh slogan "Return to our roots," and inspired the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, founded 1930, sowing the seeds of independence and freedom. African nationalist awakening. In Africa, despite French mandates and British Commonwealth rule, the spirit of nationalism began to rise. Egypt. In 1922, Britain ended its formal protectorate, proclaiming an independent kingdom, but maintained troops and control of the Suez Canal. The Wafd movement demanded an end to foreign intervention, culminating in the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, granting greater autonomy. Senegal, French West Africa. Intellectuals like Blaise Diagne fought for voting rights and an end to forced labour, forming the League of Black Education, Ligue de l'Enseignement in Dakar and Bamako. South Africa. In 1918, black veterans returning from Europe demanded full citizenship rights. Their struggle led in 1923 to the founding of the Native Congress, the forerunner of the African National Congress, ANC. Challenges of the new order. Even with the League in place, the post-war order remained precarious. Absence of the US. Despite Wilson's efforts, the US Senate refused to join, leaving the League without the enforcement muscle of its most powerful democracy. Financial crises. Reparations weakened Germany, but also strained British and French public finances, triggering inflation and industrial downturns in the 1920s. Border disputes. Along the Sikkim frontier, India-Tibet, conflict simmered. In the Middle East, the 1921 Jaffa-Tel Aviv clash erupted. In East Africa, the Kenyawas and Tanganyika saw uprisings against forced labour. Hopes and aspirations. Amid these tensions, there were still shared wishes. No more war. The motto of a European youth network called the League of Youth for Peace, in Paris, London and Berlin. They sent a message of the peace generation to Geneva, imploring the League to act decisively to prevent another world conflict. The Ruhr Crisis, 1923. After Germany defaulted on its instalment reparations payments under the treaty, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. In January 1923, steel mills, coal mines and railway lines were all brought under foreign control. The Weimar government called for passive resistance. Workers went on strike, and citizens boycotted production, bringing the economy to a standstill. In industrial cities, such as Essen and Dortmund, people survived on food relief from the International Red Cross. They hollowed out bread loaves and filled them with cornstarch and drank thin cassava soup. The papermark plummeted in value as brutally as a midwinter freeze. Bundles of banknotes were torn up and burned for warmth. The chaos ended when the United States implemented the Dawes Plan, 1924, providing loans and restructuring Germany's debt, restoring peace to the Ruhr. Entering the Golden Era, les années folles. After the crisis, Europe entered les années folles, the dazzling crazy years. Glamorous Paris buzzed with jazz music, champagne flowed freely, and the Bauhaus architectural style emerged. Berlin at night glowed with cabaret lights, and avant-garde theatre drew excited audiences. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay deep imbalances. Vienna's major bank, Kreditanstalt, collapsed in 1931. German industry depended heavily on credit, and French farmers still retracted under low agricultural prices. These were the seeds from which radical ideologies, communism and fascism, sprang forth. The global economic crisis, 1929-1933. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, on the New York Stock Exchange, the collapse began. The shockwaves from Wall Street quickly spread to London, Paris and Berlin. Short-term lenders withdrew funds and businesses failed en masse. In Manchester and Detroit, textile mills and automobile factories ground to a halt, leaving tens of thousands unemployed. In Berlin, hundreds of thousands lined up for free bread. The Weimar government launched a rescue package, but public debt soared. In New York, President Hoover called for strong intervention, laying the groundwork for the New Deal. In contrast, many European governments hesitated, trusting in free markets, resulting in a crisis that dragged on until 1933, the rise of extremism. Economic instability created fertile ground for extremist movements. Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi party capitalized on the crisis, calling to restore national pride and punish Versailles. In 1933, after a turbulent election, Hitler was appointed Chancellor, inaugurating a dictatorship. Italy, Benito Mussolini had consolidated fascism from 1922 onward, using the black shirts to suppress opposition. He proclaimed the state above the individual and pursued ambitions in the Mediterranean. France, the Croix de Feu and Parti Populaire Français, PPF, demanded greater presidential powers and the militarization of government. Though they never seized full control, they weakened faith in the Third Republic. From the Versailles Order to the echoes of World War II. The Paris treaties meant to secure peace faced harsh realities. Sudeten and Polish Czech cracks empowered Hitler to seize leadership and demand border revisions. Economic crisis led Britain and France to prioritise domestic recovery over military readiness. The League of Nations, despite its Geneva headquarters, had no enforcement power, watching helplessly as Japan seized Manchuria, 1931, and Italy invaded Ethiopia, 1935. Hopes and historical lessons. Amid the storm, voices of warning persisted. In his old age, Georges Clemenceau famously said, "He who would not prepare for war must prepare for defeat." Albert Einstein, exiled in Europe, wrote pleading letters to abolish draconian reparations to heal national wounds. Silently, social peace movements sprang up. The Pugwash conferences, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and student alliances across Paris and Berlin. They sent the Geneva Petition, demanding bans on chemical and gas weapons, and lobbied the League of Nations to uphold lasting peace. Cultural legacy, echoes in art and literature. Modernism. The war shattered old frameworks and spurred artists to explore new forms. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon emerged with bitter realism, rejecting any false heroism. They conveyed the desolation of the trenches, taking readers into the muddy fields where human spirits snapped like barbed wire. Dark romanticism. German painter Otto Dix depicted the post-war horror in his series Der Krieg, with twisted, bleeding corpses and vacant faces that haunt viewers with life's fragility. In France, poet Guillaume Apollinaire introduced calligrams, visual poems reflecting the shattered fragments of a collapsing world. Musical contrast. Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg shifted from late romantic motifs toward atonality, as if the clangor of war had torn apart the foundations of music. In England, Ralph Vaughan Williams composed his Pastoral Symphony to evoke pre-war peace, a living gift to returning soldiers. Advances in science and technology. Battlefield medicine. Sulfonamide antibiotics were first tested, cutting death rates from infection. Mobile X-ray units and improved wound suturing techniques saved hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers. Weapons and mechanisation. The British Mark I French Renault FT tanks inaugurated the age of mechanised warfare, transforming infantry tactics. The rolling barrage became the standard for artillery-infantry coordination. Civil aviation. 3 million hours of reconnaissance and fighter-flight experience were transferred to civilian airlines. In the early 1920s, Air France, KLM and British Airways each launched their first passenger routes across Europe. Human and social progress, women's rights and suffrage. Tens of thousands of women served as nurses, factory workers, and ambulance drivers, proving their capabilities equal to men and fueling the suffrage movement. Britain, 1918, Germany, 1919, and the United States, 1920, extended voting rights to women, ushering in a new half-century of democracy. Veterans' welfare. The concept of veterans' welfare was born, with institutions, hospitals, and rehabilitation centres for the wounded. Organisations such as the Royal British Legion, UK, and the American Legion established pensions, housing, and mental health support for ex-servicemen, labour rights and social insurance. Post-war labour crises led many countries to introduce unemployment insurance, basic health insurance, and minimum wage laws, early building blocks of the later welfare state. Post-war philosophy and psychology. Existentialism. The war's horrors paved the way for Sartre and Camus to explore themes of existence, freedom, and personal responsibility. Man is condemned to be free became a central thesis, reflecting the lost generation's existential anguish. War psychology. Sigmund Freud and his followers studied shell shock, laying the groundwork for our modern understanding of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Psychoanalytic therapies were applied to veterans, seeding the development of contemporary psychological treatment. Reconstruction and peace-building architecture and urban planning. Rebuilding in Verdun, Ypres, and Reims employed reinforced concrete Art Deco designs, setting a model for other cities. New bridges and modernised railways reconnected the Voie Sacrée, Sacred Way, spurring economic recovery in northeastern France. International law. The Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations Charter established the foundations of modern international law, with the first international courts and resolutions banning chemical and eventually nuclear weapons. Though imperfect, they enshrined principles of national sovereignty and outlawed aggressive war. Folk memory and commemoration. Armistice Day, 11th November. Across the Allied nations, Remembrance Day, UK, Canada, Armistice Day, France, and Veterans Day, USA, became national holidays. Observances include a 2-minute silence and the red poppy as a symbol of remembrance. Songs and festivals, although written later, We'll Meet Again, UK, 1940s, and Germany's Lili Marleen became intertwined with wartime memory, both born of themes of parting and hope for reunion. The collapse of Versailles peace. Although the Treaty of Versailles and its subsidiary treaties, Saint-Germain, Trianon, Neuilly, Sèvres, Lausanne, formally ended the war, they left behind a host of geopolitical contradictions. Lingering resentment. Germany was assigned sole war guilt and huge reparations, filling the German people with anger. National humiliation combined with economic crisis, hyperinflation, high unemployment, created fertile ground for extremist movements. Orphaned minorities. Central Europe's heart was rent as German Bohemians, Hungarians, Slovaks and others were cast outside their mother country, leading to internal conflicts and later separatist movements. Middle Eastern unrest. The mandates drawn by Britain and France dashed Arab hopes for independence, imposing foreign administration. The nascent Arab-Jewish problem sowed seeds for future dangerous conflicts. Every treaty, signed under Versailles' glittering Hall of Mirrors, was battered and torn apart by subsequent upheavals, laying the foundation for a turbulent new chapter in history. Lessons etched in memory. The world learned painful lessons. Never underestimate the consequences of collective punishment. Forcing Germany to shoulder massive reparations without a recovery plan led to collapse of faith and the rise of extremism. Respect the rights of national self-determination. Millions placed under alien rule traded freedom for resentment and endless conflict. Peace is more than a treaty. True peace must include justice, social welfare, and development opportunities for all, not merely a signed document. Seeds of the coming storm. Even in the vibrant 1920s, Les Années Folles, signs of World War II's approach emerged. Rise of fascism. In Germany, economic turmoil and Versailles hatred nourished the Nazi Party. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime paved the way for the Axis alliance. Separatist and ultranationalist movements, extremist groups in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Greece, and Bulgaria rejected new borders and stood ready to demonstrate and riot. League of Nations weakness. Without the US and lacking enforcement powers, the League could only condemn aggression, watching helplessly as Japan seized Manchuria, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. Indomitable hope. Yet the war's legacy was not only violence and division, humanitarian and international spirit, relief and peace organizations, Red Cross, American Relief Administration, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, kept alive the vow, never again. Scientific and cultural advances, from rehabilitative medicine and trauma psychology to modernist art, the post-war generation broke new creative ground. Vision of global cooperation. Though imperfect, the League of Nations paved the way for the United Nations, an ongoing effort to secure peace and common security. Conclusion and message. We have journeyed through the First World War, from Sarajevo's spark, across the Flanders trenches, an Italian-Austrian front, through Eastern and Western Europe, the Russian Civil War, the Paris Peace Conference, to the war's global aftermath. The conflict, with the nearly 40 million casualties, forever changed humanity. It shattered illusions of noble warfare, raised questions about the value of life and nations' responsibilities, but also awakened resilience, creativity, and a yearning for peace. Let the memory of those fiery years serve as a small reminder. Whenever we face injustice, division, or the threat of confrontation, recall the call for lasting peace. A peace that must be cultivated through compassion, justice, and mutual respect. And should you one day close your eyes, think of the soldiers huddled in muddy, snowy trenches, the nurses at their sides, the artists capturing horrors, and all of us, survivors, cherishing every moment of peace. For that is the greatest legacy the First World War left us, the will to live and the dream of peace today and always. The end.